Atlanta's most popular nightclub was more than just a party last night. It was a battleground of emotions, drama, and unadulterated tension. Imagine a packed dance floor that was shaking the place, strobe lights cutting through the crowd, drinks flowing, and the city's elite mixing. In the midst of all this chaos, Kirk Frost and Young Jock entered, not just because they were having a party, but because they had a serious goal in mind, and their target was Lil Scrappy, a man who could light up any space with. This was not just a heated exchange, it was a full-fledged face-off that had the entire club on edge. However, what pushed Kirk and Jock to confront Scrappy so boldly, and how far did it go before everything exploded? His magnetic presence began with slow, icy stares, hushed words, and a storm brewing beneath the surface. Then, everything changed in an instant, and the words turned sharp. The center of the dance floor suddenly became a battleground, and phones sprang up, recording every second. Although the night had just begun, security had to intervene because the energy inside the Atlanta nightclub was already electric. It was the kind of night that people talk about for weeks, with booming music, flashing lights, and a crowd that kept growing. Outside, the crew stretched around the block, full of the most fashionable and connected people in the city. If you had status, this was the place to be. The dance floor was alive with life, with strobe lights flickering and syncing to the people were in their zone everywhere you looked. With faces lost in the music at the bar, groups huddled over cocktails, and shouting to be heard over the deafening beat. However, up in the VIP section, the atmosphere was different. It wasn't about celebration, but rather something that was brewing beneath the surface. Kirk Frost and Young Jock were sitting in their private booths, with entourages buzzing around them. They looked the part, wearing expensive liquor and exuding a sense of success. The people around them either didn't notice or didn't care too much, too preoccupied with the benefits of being in the orbit of two major names across the room in another VIP booth. Lil Scrappy was the life of his own party, where Kirk and Jock were locked in thought. Scrappy's laughter cut through the music, his movements effortless, and the tension between them was invisible to most but impossible to ignore. Unquestionably charismatic, he wasn't just there. He owned the place, and people gravitated towards him. Glasses clinked, and every few minutes someone stopped by to pay their respects. Scrappy had always been the type of guy who could make an ordinary night into something special, and tonight was no exception. But beneath the surface, things were changing. At first, it was just a glance here and a whispered conversation there. But as the minutes went by, it became evident that Kirk leaned in and spoke softly. At Scrappy's table, however, the atmosphere remained electric and unconcerned. He moved towards the dance floor, stopping to greet a few familiar faces and raising his glass in acknowledgement of the weight of their conversation. However, Jock's expression darkened whatever they were talking about. It wasn't just casual conversation. The energy around them changed. A waitress delivering drinks hesitated, sensing the shift, her eyes flickering between Kirk's clenched jaw and Jock's narrowed gaze before swiftly moving on. He didn't show it, and the Jock watched him as Jack tightened. He leaned closer to Kirk, saying, "You see what I'm seeing?" over the pounding bass. Kirk didn't respond right away, his eyes fixed on Scrappy's every move. Eventually, he nodded, "Yes," in a measured voice. "I see it." This was a history that most people in the club were unaware of. The three men had been friends for years, attending the same events and hanging out with the same people. The DJ changed tracks, and the dance floor erupted with lights and faster bodies. Scrappy's rise, unfiltered confidence, and growing influence had made him a favorite to many, but not to everyone. For Kirk and Jock, it wasn't just about him. It was about what he represented, his unwavering confidence, and his ability to draw attention with his way of moving as if nothing could touch him. For some, that statement wasn't welcome. Move tighter, and the club's energy peaked. At that point, Kirk and Jock got up, and without saying a word, they started to push through the crowd and go straight for Scrappy. Meanwhile, Scrappy was engrossed in the moment, nodding to fans who were calling his name, raising his glass, and keeping the energy going. But those around him saw it coming. The atmosphere changed, and then all of a sudden, by the time Scrappy looked up, it was too late. Already there, Kirk stopped a few feet away. So he put his hands in his pockets as the Jock moved closer. The music, the flashlights, the distant laughter, and everything else faded into the background as a heavy silence filled their space with tension. Scrappy lowered his drink a little, his usual grin dimming, and straightened his posture as he assessed the situation. He asked in a casual but cautious tone, "What's going on, guys?" And his crew stirred a couple of them to stand up. No one spoke, but the tension in the room was evident even to those watching. Kirk didn't respond immediately, instead studying Scrappy with an unreadable expression. And then he said, "You've been running your mouth," in a voice that was low and even, sparking drama. Scrappy's grip tightened around his glass, and he raised an eyebrow, but his usual assurance in his voice faltered. "I'm not sure what you mean," claimed that although his words were firm, something in his posture betrayed him. His eyes darted towards his booth, where his crew were now completely awake and whispered to one another, but no one moved. Scrappy knew that was his battle, and if he had anything to say, he continued turning back to them and saying it. His body language was calm and collected, but his eyes told a different story. "We have plenty to say," said Jockey, with a voice that was sharp enough to cut through. Scrappy didn't flinch at the noise, and if you're smart, you'll listen. In fact, his posture got firmer. His tone edged into defiance, and his free hand curled into a fist at his side. He took a step forward and was now almost toe-to-toe with the jock. The people around them moved. Some stepped back, while others leaned in, drawn in by the prospect of an explosion. At that point, the nightclub wasn't about the music, the drinks, or the party that Kirk was in. Everyone could sense what was about to happen, but Jack spoke first. "You know what this is about," he said, pointing a finger at Scrappy. "You've been talking out of long-spreading lies. You think you can run." Frost Young Jock and Lil Scrappy stood in an entirely different battlefield nearby. Scrappy's crew were tense, some standing, some hovering near the booth, their eyes darting between the three men, their whispers quick and urgent. Scrappy's chin was raised, and Jack tightened. "If I have something to say, I'll say it," he shot back, "but don't come at me with weak accusations unless you have something solid." At that point, Kirk stepped forward, his expression icy cold. "We've got more than just words," Scrappy said. "We've got receipts." With a quick swipe, he unlocked his phone and held up the screen, and the glare of the device reflected off Scrappy's face, and he squinted to make out the details. He didn't need to see it, though, because the weight of Kirk's move made Scrappy's jaw tense. He then said, "You're going to show me some out-of-context messages. That's your proof." He scoffingly waved a dismissive hand, but his voice wasn't as steady as before. His bravado was still there, but his stance had changed slightly. Was the kind of subtle shift that only occurs when someone begins to feel the walls closing in. Standing shoulder to shoulder with Kirk, the jock stated, "This isn't out of context. You've been playing both sides, saying one thing to us and another to everyone else." Then he leaned in and said, "It's time to own up before it gets worse." Scrappy's annoyance boiled over, and he planted his feet, squared his shoulders, and locked eyes with the two men. "You think you can come in here and press me?" he said. "Now who do you think you are?" Heads turned from nearby. The nightclub's pulse continued to pound, the bass continued to thud, and the lights continued to flash. But in this small area, all attention was on them. A small group of people were gathered at the edges, drawn in by the fire that was burning between them. Opposite him, Kirk didn't blink. His voice was measured and controlled, but underneath was steel, which is larger than you think. He leaned in just a little, and you keep running your mouth, and it's going to hurt not just you but everyone around you. Maybe consider that before continuing to push your luck. Scrappy took a deep, slow breath, his fists clenching at his sides and his shoulders stiff. "If you have anything to say," he said, "speak now," his voice low and simmering, because behind him, his crew tightened their formation and stepped in closer. They didn't say anything, but their presence said enough. A loose semicircle formed behind him, a wall of silent support. The jock smirked and shook his head, saying, "You've said too much already." Said, "We're just here to make sure you know we're not letting it slide." And then abruptly Kirk moved forward until Scrappy could feel the heat of his breath. His voice faded into the background of the music, but it was still sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Keep talking," Kirk whispered, "and you'll see what happens next." Scrappy didn't move or blink, but his heart pounded and his voice was solid. "You don't scare me," he said. "You never did." The energy in the room changed once more. Kirk clenched his fists, his eyes narrowed, and Scrappy's crew edged closer. Their muscles coiled for whatever was about to happen. The crowd was on the verge of exploding, but a firm hand cut through the moment and landed on Kirk's shoulder. "All right, that's enough." The security guard's big, calm, authoritative voice said, "Take it outside or take a seat." Kirk didn't move at first, his eyes still fixed on Scrappy, and his expression remained unfazed. The jock took a step back, rolling. Although his shoulders remained tense, Scrappy's stance gradually relaxed as he exhaled, but the fire in his eyes never went out. The security guard wasn't playing when he gestured towards their booths and said, "I don't care who you are," saying, "Vote like stone, this isn't the place for that." For a brief moment, it appeared as though Kirk and Jock might push back, but Kirk put his phone back in his pocket and said, "We'll settle another time." Jack gave Scrappy a final glance before turning away. There were no more words or threats, only unspoken promises, and they disappeared into the crowd as they walked back towards their VIP section. Scrappy didn't move immediately because his breath was still a little heavy and his hands were still tingling from the rush. One of his crew members touched his shoulder and Scrappy blinked, forcing himself to ease back into the moment. "I'm good," he said, picking up his drink, taking a slow sip, and turning towards his booth's voice was steady and calm, but there was a hint of tension beneath it. They were all talking, and he let the words settle as they always had. But as he sat down, the sensation in his stomach wouldn't go away. The way Kirk and Jock had approached him and looked at him wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. As the night went on, the tension didn't go away. Instead, it thickened and settled into the air like smoke that wouldn't go away. Kirk and Jock were back in their booth, but the energy was different now in their conversation. On the other side of the club, Scrappy tried his best to shake it off. He leaned back in his booth, drink in hand, a smirk still on his lips, but those who knew him best saw through it. His crew stayed close, their conversations hushed, their eyes cutting towards Kirk and Jockey every few minutes, and the entire club fell off like a storm hanging just overhead. Drinks sat untouched, their conversation non-existent. They were no longer just two men out for a time, they were now watching and waiting to decide their next move. A private standoff turned into public knowledge in record time as people whispered about what they had witnessed, embellishing every detail like storytellers spinning a legend. One woman near the bar was leaning close to her friends, her voice hushed but urgent. I swear, Kirk and Jock were about to set it off, and a man at the other end of the club smirked as he told his version of events, and Scrappy stood them down like a champ. They didn't want any. It didn't matter that no fists had been thrown. The rumors took over. Then the phones came out, and a shaky video appeared on social media. It was only a few seconds of footage taken from across the room, and it didn't show much. Just Kirk and the Jock standing in front of Scrappy. The moment's weight was heavy, but it was enough. Within minutes, the hashtag began trending. The club staff tried their best to keep the evening going, but they knew this wasn't just. Back in VIP, Kirk checked his phone and clenched his jaw as he scrolled through the influx of comments. They were talking like we were the guys. He muttered in a low-controlled but tight voice of frustration, like we started this dot. He looked at the screen and shook his head, saying, "It's just noise," but after a moment, maybe it was time to set the record straight. Kirk nodded, but his eyes didn't soften. In the meantime, Scrappy's crew were watching the same firestorm on their screens across the club. One of his boys turned his phone towards him and smiled, saying, "You're a legend, man, calling you the king of the club." Scrappy gave a brief laugh, but it was without humor, his fingers drumming against his glass and his eyes darting towards Kirk and Jock's booth. "Yeah," he muttered, but we both knew they weren't. He finished by taking a slow sip of his drink without looking away. They were sitting there planning, so he put the glass down with a quiet clink. "You think it's over?" "No, they're just getting started." As the club closed, the energy outside was just as intense as it had been inside. People were still chatting and exchanging stories, speculating that what had begun as a confrontation had turned into a full-fledged saga. This wasn't just a night out anymore. It was a moment, a story that had the city talking inside. Kirk and Jock finally got up. They hadn't touched another drink and hadn't needed to say much because the air between them was full of unspoken plans. Kirk looked towards the exit and said, "Let's go," without hesitation. Jock followed without turning around, and they didn't exchange words, just a silent assurance that it wasn't the end. Scrappy watched them go, his jaw clenched, thinking they were simply going to leave and come at me another day. One of his boys leaned in and whispered, but Scrappy shook his head and kept his eyes fixed on the door. "This isn't over outside," he muttered. The night air was cool, but the tension was still high. A crowd had gathered near the valet, and people were scrolling through their phones and arguing, and Kirk and Jock moved through them in silence, their presence dividing the crowd like a ripple in water. They got into their cars and closed them quietly. The glow of their phones illuminated the interior as they scrolled through the online storm, with some people praising Scrappy and others demanding that Kirk and Jock drop more receipts. Kirk's expression darkened, and he said, "You know what we need to do." Jock looked over his face unreadable, but he nodded, knowing that they didn't need to explain that the club drama was just the real fight that was coming next. That's where we stand now. Tensions boiling, alliances cracking, a storm brewing behind the scenes. Now for the real question. What do you think happened? And tell us in the comments whether that club is Kirk and Jock's version of events, or if Scrappy is simply the next victim of a behind-the-scenes power play. I promise you won't want to miss what happens next, so please subscribe and turn on notifications because this is far from finished.